If you're a last-minute gift shopper, then Instacart is your holiday rescue app this season. No more tracking packages, no more trips to the post office, and no more Christmas gifts arriving in February. Instead, you can just download Instacart to order gifts like beauty, tech, and gourmet goods from local stores and get them delivered in as fast as 1 hour. Plus, right now, you'll get free delivery on your first 3 orders. This offer is valid for a limited time. $10 minimum per order. Additional terms apply. Must be 21 plus to purchase alcohol where available.
Hey guys, it is Ryan. I'm not sure if you know this about me, but I'm a bit of a fun fanatic when I can. I like to work, but I like fun too. It's a thing. And now the truth is out there. I can tell you about my favorite place to have fun. Chumba Casino. They have hundreds of social casino style games to choose from with new games released each week. You can play for free anytime, anywhere. And each day brings a new chance to collect daily bonuses. So join me in the fun. Sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18 plus.
Listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome to True Crime, the podcast that helps you find new, emerging, and undiscovered true crime podcasts. I'm Greg, the host and curator of True Crime. Today's episode is from Mountain Murders. Mountain Murders is an Appalachian true crime podcast. If you like today's episode, make sure to check out the episode description for links to subscribe. All right, let's get this show started.
Begin.
Some content may not be suitable for all listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
We say fuck a lot. Hey, y'all. Welcome back to Mountain Murders. I'm Heather.
And I'm Dylan.
Hey, Dylan.
Hey, girl.
How you doing?
I'm doing wonderful.
Oh, man, we dropped a couple of episodes this weekend. I'm feeling very good. We're in the podcast studio, which is our happy place.
Yes, our happy, empty place now.
Yeah, we've started packing.
So if it sounds a little tinny, that is why, because there's nothing left in this room but our equipment.
Well, that's true. Dylan, it was a gorgeous weekend here in Western North Carolina. Now we have listeners all over the world. The fall leaves, well, they've slowly disappeared.
The leaves done left.
Yeah, so the color is gone. But we had a beautiful sunny day. I was able to get out earlier and take Rufus on a nice long walk. And it put me in just the best mood.
Yeah, it's amazing what that old sun and that vitamin D will do for you.
It's true. And of course, we also get a dose of vitamin D every time you open your mouth.
It's true.
Yeah, probably not the same, but it makes us all happy, Dylan.
Yeah, I give my wife a dose of vitamin D.
No.
I
would like to give a shout out to our 2 patrons, Karen and Elizabeth, who have re-upped their sponsorship.
Thank you so much.
So they are responsible for today's episode. Dylan, we really don't have a lot of time to dilly-dally. This episode is a lengthy one, and there's so much information, and I wanted to make sure I told our listeners the best, most factual version of this case, because there's a great deal of misinformation that has been circulated on the internet, and I've even listened to a few other podcasts, and their facts are not the same facts that I have.
And we've even watched a couple of really crappy movies.
Oh, we have. So I just want to make sure we give a very detailed, factual case. We're breaking up into 2 parts. We're bringing you part 1. And I'm assuming if you're listening to the episode, you saw the title. We're going to be talking about the Boston Strangler today.
Man, I cannot wait because I've always heard of this case, but I've never dug into the details. And and the whole time Heather's been researching this, she's like, oh my gosh, she's learning a lot as well. And so, yeah, let's just dive straight in.
Yeah, again, this is a case I'm not super familiar with, but through my research have managed to learn a great deal. And it's very interesting. I feel like this case sets some precedences for how serial killer investigations are now conducted in modern times, and how this case really changed, I think, a lot here in the United States as far as crime and investigation, task force, the FBI's involvement in creating the behavioral unit. What is that? The BAU, Behavior Analysis Unit.
Yeah.
Okay, you ready?
Let's go.
Yeah, see y'all buckled up over there.
I'm ready to learn.
The Boston Strangler remains one of the most notorious and enigmatic figures in the annals of American crime. Operating during the 1960s, the serial killer terrorized the city of Boston, leaving a trail of fear and uncertainty in his wake. A unique blend of brutality, mystery, and public intrigue marks the case of the Boston Strangler. 55-year-old divorcee Anna Slessers. By the way, I feel like before we get started, I do need to offer up a trigger warning. There are some pretty graphic depictions of sexual violence in this case. I have tried to limit the, amount of gross information that is available, but I do have to discuss some things that are going to be hard to hear. They're going to be hard for me to talk about, and I know some folks will have difficulty hearing this episode. And if that kind of thing is not for you, I understand. We don't hate you for it.
We'll see you next time.
We ain't mad at you, but just wanted to let people know. And again, I try to give a complete picture, but I will omit some of the more graphic details because this is a horrific case.
Yeah, I did not actually realize there was some of this brutality that you've already described to me. But I think you do have to talk about some of it because it really sets the stage for the entirety of the story, honestly.
Well, absolutely. And getting into the psychology, which we will probably dabble more into that subject matter when we get to part 2. But I think it's really important to get a clear picture of exactly how awful these crimes were. All right, back to it, Dylan. 55-year-old divorcee Anna Slessers had only lived at 77 Gainsborough Street for 2 weeks. Slessers had grown up in Latvia, where she was married with 2 kids. During World War II, she was divorced from her husband and fled the country to a German refugee camp. Eventually, Anna and her 2 children, she has a son and a daughter, they could immigrate to the United States where they were able to live with family in Michigan. Anna earned a degree in Latvia where she had worked as a bookkeeper. Yet, she took on menial work in the United States to make a living. Anna paid for her son Juris to attend the University of Maryland. Her daughter Maja was married, remaining in Maryland. Juris, who worked as a research engineer at MIT's Lincoln Laboratories, had wanted to get an apartment for himself. Up until that point, he and his mother had stayed in Boston together and were living together. But now he's 25 years old and he is seeking independence from his mother. So Anna, a seamstress who earned about $62 a week, moved into a small apartment in an area known as the Back Bay.
Yeah, you see this sometimes. You'll have someone who has degrees in other countries and then they come here. I'm not sure if it's because the documentation or the degrees don't translate or not recognized in America, but a lot of times they end up doing these menial jobs, which I would think would be tough if you're someone who's educated.
You're right, Dylan. And it is kind of an unusual, I'm not sure what the translation, if the degrees or the education doesn't translate here.
Or it's not recognized, if you will.
Or why that is. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I've heard of foreign nationals who have medical degrees.
Physicists.
But can't find work in the United States, or they're not accredited to work in hospitals here. I mean, it's unusual. And maybe one of our listeners knows a bit more about that and could enlighten us, because I'm not really sure why that is.
Right.
Now, the Back Bay area, through my research, discovered, Dylan, at the time during the 1960s, the Back Bay was considered maybe not like the nicest neighborhood, but it wasn't the worst neighborhood either, if that makes sense. The rent was cheap. I think some of the buildings at some point might have been a little nicer, but they were more run down at this point. They offered cheap rent. There were a lot of young people who lived in this area, a lot of college students. Listening to a few other podcasts on the subject matter, one in particular that I will go ahead and mention was one of my resources. Well, I kind of went back and listened to it after I wrote the episode just to see what it was about and learned a great deal more. It's called Stranglers.
Yeah, you said that was a good one.
It's a great series that dives into the Boston Strangler case, but they have interviews with a lot of people who were living in Boston at this time, the early 60s. And they were saying, this was an area just kind of full of young people, a lot of college students. You could walk down the street and there were lots of young college students drinking and partying in the bars and kind of hooting and hollering. Some of the young women who lived in the area at the time said they would see flashers.
Oh, wow.
And there were peeping toms and that kind of thing, but yet it didn't make you feel super unsafe.
Right, it was more almost comical to,
or just like what's going on here. But it wasn't like a neighborhood where people felt truly unsafe. It was more just like there are a lot of drunk young college frat parties happening and people exposing themselves, but maybe not in like a nefarious way. I don't know.
I cordially expose my genitals.
Well, I mean, nobody wants to be flashed. Let's be honest.
No, but I get what you're saying.
They were a little bit more dismissive of it as like, well, it didn't really seem like it was this deviant act, but it wasn't an uncommon thing on a Saturday night to walk down the street and there be a flasher.
Well, it's more like it's shenanigans than it is like actually dangerous stuff.
Perhaps. So the day before, Anna had been sent home early by her employer at Decorator Fabrics Incorporated and told not to return until Monday, which gave the woman a long weekend. And I'm not sure why they gave her this extended weekend. Maybe they just were kind of closing up shop or whatever. So she had asked her son, Juris, if he would drive her to the Latvian Lutheran Church in Roxbury. See, June 14th was considered a national day of mourning for Latvians to remember those that were lost during the Russian invasion, which happened in World War II. Juris reluctantly agreed to pick his mother up at 7 p.m. for the church service. He was uninterested in attending, but he also felt guilty for telling his mother no.
So he didn't want to go, but he didn't want to tell his mom, I'm not into it.
Right. He doesn't want to tell her, I'm not going to come give you a ride.
Right.
He's like, okay. I mean, we all know how some mothers have a certain way of guilt tripping you, right?
Well, maybe you just don't want to disappoint them or let them down.
Earlier, Anna had baked muffins for Juris, leaving them out to cool. And at some point, she had also written out some checks for utility bills. These were lying on the table as if she had just, signed these checks. Around 7 p.m., Juris parked and climbed the stairs to her third-floor apartment. There was no answer when he knocked. Assuming his mother was using the bathroom, Juris returned downstairs and waited for Anna. After nearly half an hour of waiting on his mother, he grew agitated and returned to the front door, knocking louder. He tried the door, but it was locked. Around 7:45 p.m., after receiving no indication that his mother was joining him, Juris decided to ram the door open with his shoulder.
So now it sounds like he's getting worried about what's happened to his mother.
Well, yeah, at this point he's thinking, well, did she have some kind of medical emergency? Is she sick?
Right. His imagination's probably running wild.
Yes. Now, the apartment was quiet. He knocked on the door of the bathroom, but he heard nothing. When Juris pushed the door open, he made a startling discovery. His mother, Anna, was hanging by her bathrobe's belt over the door.
Oh, my God.
Juris immediately called for the police. Though she was wearing a bathrobe, it was open in front, exposing her nude body. The bathtub was about a third full of water. At first, Boston police believed it was a suicide, and her son thought this as well, because she had been having I wouldn't say she was in like a full-on depression, but he did say she had been troubled or had been having, some issues.
Right, just having a tough time, maybe, worried about who knows what. But so he's went from reluctantly going to get his mom and take her to this thing to finding her dead. I mean, I just don't even know how you process that.
No. When a detective named Mellon showed up, he challenged that assertion. From the evidence, it was clear to him that Mrs. Slessor was a victim of homicide. She had suffered head injuries and strangulation. There was no sign of rape, but she had been sexually assaulted. I don't have a great deal of details about this, but I will say that in several of these cases, which we will, we'll get into discussing this more, there were objects used for the sexual assault.
Yeah, and I tell you, that always strikes me as very, very weird. And that type of deviancy, I don't know. I don't even know how you realize that that's something you want to do.
It's very violent.
Yes.
And deranged.
And humiliating.
Yes. Yeah, there definitely seems to be more of a sadistic quality to that type of sexual assault, right? Some drawers appeared to be ransacked, though nothing of value was missing. It struck Mellon as odd, as if the burglary was staged. A gold watch sat on a shelf above the bathtub untouched, and a few other valuables were left behind at the apartment. The otherwise tidy apartment had a kitchen wastebasket with trash strewn across the floor. When questioned, neighbors didn't know the woman who'd only briefly lived in the building, so they didn't have a lot of information to offer up. The neighbor who resided in the apartment below had returned from work at 6 p.m. that evening and laid down for a nap. Around 6:10 p.m., he recalled hearing a series of loud thuds, but nothing more. I mean, this guy even thought, he didn't really know much about this new tenant, but he thought immediately like, oh no, I've got a very loud person living upstairs. Is this person a dancer?
Yeah.
Because of these thuds.
I'm going to have to deal with this now.
Yeah. Upon investigation, Boston police learned that Mrs. Slessor lived a relatively quiet life. She didn't have much of a social life, Dylan. She went to work and church. She had no male friends. At work, it was learned she didn't associate with the other employees. She didn't have much of a social life at all. Her former husband, whom she had divorced they've been divorced 20 years at this point, was remarried and living in Canada. So they ruled out the possibility that it was an ex-husband.
Yeah, because he's already moved on with his life, and he's a very long ways away.
With little to go on, Boston police were not hopeful the case would be solved. Although 90% of murders were cleared, experience had proven that if the killer wasn't caught within 2 weeks, it usually became a cold case. That's how the Boston PD viewed this. On a Saturday afternoon, June 30th, Nina Nichols, a 68-year-old woman, arrived at her apartment at 1940 Commonwealth Avenue. She had been out of town for several days with friends, but was due for dinner and an overnight visit with her sister. It was after 5 p.m., so she knew she would have to rush to Wellesley Hills, where her sister lived. Mrs. Nichols took time to open the windows. It was a very hot day. It was like 90 degrees outside. So she immediately opens the windows to her apartment, trying to air it out while she's, I guess, packing a bag and trying to quick ready herself to go to the sister's house, right?
Yeah, a lot of times I forget, even though that's so far north, Boston, New York, it gets very, very hot there.
It does get very hot there.
I oftentimes forget, like, oh yeah, I didn't even know it gets hot like that. Yeah, sweltering heat.
Absolutely. So she opens the windows and changed into a thin house dress before calling her sister Marguerite Stedman to confirm that she would arrive around 6 p.m. During the call, Nina was interrupted. Nina said, "Excuse me, Marguerite, there's my buzzer. I'll call you right back." And that would be the last time that Marguerite would speak to her sister. When Nina didn't return the call, Marguerite asked her husband, Chester Stedman, who is an attorney, to ring Nina. There was no answer. He told his wife to wait longer because she might be stuck in traffic. By 7:30 p.m., Nina had not shown up at the Stedman home. Chester Stedman phoned 65-year-old Thomas Bruce, the building's superintendent. Stedman asked Bruce to check on Nina. Nina's car was still in the parking lot behind the building, so Mr. Bruce looks out. He says, well, her car is still here. At that point, Mr. Bruce goes to Nina's apartment, where he uses a master key to unlock the apartment door. From where the janitor stood at the doorway, he could see that Nina's apartment appeared burglarized. He could see the drawers were pulled open, belongings were lying all over the place. He could see Nina's naked body lying on the bedroom floor. Her pink housecoat and slip were pulled up above the woman's neck in knots twisted together almost like a rope. So tightly that they cut into her flesh.
My God.
2 nylon stockings were also tied around her chin.
You're listening to an episode of Mountain Murders on True Crime by Indie Drop-In Network. We're going to take a quick break.
Lucky Land Casino, asking people, what's the weirdest place you've gotten lucky?
Lucky? In line at the deli, I guess?
Aha, in my dentist's office.
More than once, actually.
Do I have to say?
Yes, you do.
In the car before my kids' PTA meeting.
Really?
Yes.
Excuse me, what's the weirdest place you've gotten lucky?
I never win and tell.
Well, there you have it. You can get lucky anywhere, playing at LuckyLandSlots.com. Play for free right now. Are you feeling lucky? No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18 plus. Terms and conditions apply. See website for details.
Hey guys, it is Ryan. I'm not sure if you know this about me, but I'm a bit of a fun fanatic when I can. I like to work, but I like fun too. It's a thing. And now the truth is out there. I can tell you about my favorite place to have fun. Chumba Casino. They have hundreds of social casino style games to choose from with new games released each week. You can play for free anytime, anywhere. And each day brings a new chance to collect daily bonuses. So join me in the fun. Sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18 plus.
Judy was boring.
Hello.
Then Judy discovered ChumbaCasino.com.
It's my little escape.
Now Judy's the life of the party.
Oh, baby, mama's bringing home the bacon.
Whoa, take it easy, Judy. The Chumba life is for everybody. So go to ChumbaCasino.com and play over 100 casino-style games. Join today and play for free for your chance to redeem some serious prizes. ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18 plus. Terms and conditions apply. See website for details.
And now back to this episode of Mountain Murders.
Nina had worked as a chief physiotherapist at Massachusetts Memorial Hospital until retiring 3 years before. She was widowed for 20 years, with her brother-in-law being the only man she had any kind of relationship with. She spent weekends with friends, sometimes summering at their homes in Florida and Maine. The woman had no known enemies. She kept no cash in her apartment, paying every bill by check, and it appeared nothing in her apartment of value had been taken. Nina was an avid photographer, Dylan, and she had a $300 camera, which was considered a very expensive item at that time.
Right.
Right? But it was, likely was the easiest item to be pawned, this nice camera, but it remained in the apartment. There were no signs of forcible entry. However, Nina was reportedly sexually assaulted with a wine bottle.
See, here you are talking to your sister, and you never know. You're just having a run-of-the-mill.
Very normal conversation.
And you never know. And that would drive me crazy if this happened to me. You never know that's going to be the last time you ever speak to them, let alone that you're going to find out that they've been brutalized and murdered. But I would never be able to stop thinking about what I should have said or maybe wish I'd said the last time I talked to them. But you always imagine that you get to talk to them again. You have no idea that's going to be the last time. That would drive me crazy.
It would be very difficult. I guess that's why they say you need to make sure the people that you love know how you feel about them.
Yeah.
And try to always end on a positive note.
Yes. This isn't goodbye. It's I'll see you later.
Boston police were examining the details. 16 days apart, but only a 5-mile square area. You have two older women who've been strangled and sexually assaulted. Their apartments ransacked. Police Commissioner Edmund McNamara called a conference for department heads. He's saying that this is a problem.
Well, yeah, it's a very strange crime. They've been assaulted with foreign objects. I mean, yeah.
65-year-old Helen Blake, a retired practical nurse. See, and this is going to be something that a lot of people point to, is several of these women had medical backgrounds. They were nurses. They worked at various hospitals. We'll see that as the story goes on. And I didn't mention this earlier, but Anna Slesser had been a very big music fan. She loved opera and symphony. And many of these women attended the Boston Symphony.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Yeah. So 65-year-old Helen Blake, a retired practical nurse, resided in an apartment number 9 at 73 Newhall Street. She had a friendly, close relationship with her neighbors, two other women, Annie Winchell and Margaret Hamilton. Now, the women were in the habit of picking up their mail, which would be dropped off at their doors. They would usually stand in their dressing gowns, checking the mail, kind of standing at the doors, gossiping and checking in with each other for the day.
Right.
And I think maybe when you get older, you fall into these routines or these habits. But I'm a creature of habit. Maybe I'm an older woman trapped in my middle-aged body.
We look forward to the mail running now. You rush to the mailbox and we go through it and see if there's any huge checks.
There never is.
Never is. And but no, I think it's just you fall into these routines, these daily routines, and it's the older folks like to stay up on their bills, keep everything even, and then they like to know what's going on around them. And hey, I would have no problem standing at the door and gossiping about.
Well, you have these 3 older women. They live alone. I'm sure they're lonely. And they've got companionship in each other. And it's a good idea. You go every day at the same time. You check your mail. You are able to kind of check in with each other, make sure everybody's doing okay.
Right.
Kind of hang out. They're your friends. So, yeah, I think that'd be fun. Right? Helen was noticeably absent on Monday when Annie and Margaret fetched the mail. Come to think of it, they agreed, the last time anyone had seen Helen was Saturday after consulting with some other neighbors. They found out no one had seen Helen. The last time they'd heard from her was Saturday, but not since. By 5 p.m., the 2 women could no longer contain themselves. They borrowed a master key from the superintendent and entered into Helen's apartment. Helen, who was very tidy, had an apartment in disarray. So that's the first thing they recognize is out of the ordinary.
Well, yeah, nobody just throws their stuff on the floor and rips drawers out of dressers and stuff like that. You're gonna find it's a striking scene.
Well, I do that, but it's only if I can't find. I'll obsessively search for an article of clothing.
Well, you typically put it back together.
Well, eventually.
I'm like, well,
But I do have this issue, though. If I look for something and cannot find it, I will obsess over a pair of tights, a certain shirt, a bodysuit, something that I want to wear. Even if I pick another outfit, I will obsess over where it is, and I will go through everything until I find it.
Yeah.
I've taken out everything from the closet and gone through every single hanger until I find what I'm looking for, because I can't stand not knowing where my things are, because I like to feel like I'm kind of organized in where my things are.
I've noticed this happen before, and I'll be like, look, we were just going to have a little barbecue, and you've tried 19 outfits on. What is happening right now?
But I can't find the shirt I want, Dylan. It's important. I know I'm neurotic. I can't help it. They've got this apartment in disarray, Dylan. Every drawer is open and emptied onto the floor. Too scared to enter, they lock the apartment and call for police.
That was a good move.
You think so?
Well, yeah, you're scene integrity.
Well, exactly. I was going to say they're preserving the crime scene.
And it's also, for all you know, whoever's done this could still be in there.
Yes, you're very smart, Dylan.
Yeah.
I think you might survive in a horror movie.
Oh, no, I'll be like, oh, hell no. And I just pull a door to, call the popo.
When Lynn police arrived, because, by the way, they live in Lynn, Massachusetts, which is just right outside of Boston. When Lynn police arrived, they found Helen Blake dead inside the apartment. She lay face down on her bed, legs spread wide apart, nude, save for the top of her pajamas, which had been pushed kind of up above her shoulders. A nylon stocking had been used to strangle the woman. It was tied tightly and knotted at her neck. A bra also connected to socks sort of formed a bow under her chin.
What in the world?
Yeah, we're going to see this more than once. This crude bow tie. It's very weird and disturbing. She had been sexually assaulted. Again, not to go into great detail, but what I gather is with a foreign object, with a possible object. She didn't have much money, but Helen owned 2 diamond rings, and they were missing. There was also discussion that she was set to inherit about $45,000, which might explain why a metal lockbox under her bed had been nearly pried open. The apartment door had a chain, a bolt, and a firm Yale lock.
Quality lock.
I don't know what a Yale lock is.
It's a brand of lock.
It is. And you're saying it's a very good lock.
Well, yeah, it's good stuff.
Okay. Well, that's good to know. I knew I kept you around for a reason.
Hey, I'm making sense today.
You would contribute something to this episode. There was no sign of forced entry. Therefore, Helen Blake must have allowed her attacker to enter. Yet, with so many neighbors, and let's be honest, these sound like maybe nosy, busybody neighbors.
Yeah, they know everything that's happening, the comings and goings of the building. And I always say, maybe the door just happened to be unlocked. They always assume that you possibly knew the person who assaulted you or something, just because there's no signs of forced entry. But I think people get in the habit of, in the cities or anywhere near the cities, of locking their doors every time they come in and out. So I think that's a fair assumption.
But it is possible that, during this time, this is the early 60s.
Right.
And Helen maybe had been in this building for a while and felt comfortable. Maybe she hadn't locked her door when she had returned from getting the mail. Who knows? But regardless, none of these busybody neighbors had heard a single sound of a struggle. According to friends and neighbors, Helen was also not the kind of woman who would have gone down without a fight. Yet everyone who knew Helen thought it was ludicrous to imagine the woman wearing only pajamas allowing a strange man to enter her apartment. She had been strangled in the kitchen, then carried to the bedroom where the assault had taken place. At least that's what police theorized. Police determined the assailant must be a strong man because Helen weighed around 165 pounds. Now, it's interesting to me, Dylan, that at this time, 165 pounds, they considered that to be
a big girl,
a hefty woman.
Okay.
And I'm like,
husky
that
lass.
Sounds like that's not that much.
No, but I will say, 165 pound person, male or female, it would be hard to move. So certainly it's not a really small person.
Right. So maybe we're just saying that, she was a stout woman. She had a build that would suggest that perhaps she, could be stout. We'll say that. But she was killed sometime between 8:15 a.m. and 10 a.m. on Saturday, June 30th. So in that short window of time.
Yeah, and it's funny, like this whole apartment's been kind of torn apart. And all this, and assault in one room and then carried into another room, and the fact that no one heard anything, that's kind of weird.
Now, Nina Nichols was also sexually assaulted and strangled to death in Boston, less than an hour by trolley from Lynn, between 5 and 6 p.m. the same day.
Oh, really?
So 2 women murdered in the same day, similar circumstances.
Wow. That's pretty wild. You seldom hear of something like that.
Police Commissioner McNamara was wrapping up his conference on Anna Slessor's and Nina Nichols when told the news about Helen Blake's murder. His words were, quote, "Oh God, we've got a madman on the loose." 3 strangulation homicides in a 2-week period was just the beginning. Boston would become a town besieged by terror as an elusive killer managed to enter locked apartments and leave behind no clues. McNamara jumped into action. He canceled all leave for officers. Every detective was assigned to homicide. A roundup of all sex offenders was ordered. A check of males between 18 to 45 who had been released from mental hospitals in the past 2 years were questioned.
See, and back then there was no, is this okay or is this politically correct? He's kind of jumping into action there. He's almost putting his own task force together, bringing all the manpower in. And, what can you do?
One order read, quote, "Special attention should be paid to persons suffering from paranoia of mother hate."
Okay.
Because at this point, police are beginning to theorize the attacker targeting these women who are like older, middle-aged women. I wouldn't call them elderly. They're ranging from like 55, into their 70s. That's the victim profile at this point. These are not like elderly women. These are like older, middle-aged women. So the police are theorizing this has to be someone who hates his mother.
Well, and I think that's a pretty good theory.
And some of them were pointing to the film Psycho and saying, like, we have a Norman Bates on our hands. We have a man who's, like, obsessed with his mother and hates his mother, terrorizing these women.
Well, I think that's a fair assumption, and they're just trying to wrap their head around this because, they're finding these women in these very shocking states, and poses and stuff. So, that's got to be shaking the police to their core,
Right, so police ran with this theory that it was a younger man who hated all older women because he hated his mother, attacking the women who symbolized his mother. And it's a solid theory. And this is actually something we've heard time and time again when it comes to many of these serial killers, especially ones who do target older females. Law enforcement officials appealed to women. Keep doors locked, allow no strangers to enter your residence, report all prowlers or unknown persons. An emergency number was set up, and it was DE-81212. Nice phone number, huh?
Yeah.
To be called day or night to report any suspicious activity.
So they're not
set up the hotline.
They're not really showing the sometimes prevalent when they don't want to admit that crimes are connected, or you have someone going around doing this over and over. They seem to be moving pretty fast.
They do, but we'll get into this here in a few minutes. They still don't want to come out and admit this is the work of one person.
Oh, okay.
Right? They're trying to be vigilant, but they still haven't made
official statements.
Official connection.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Which maybe they know it, they just don't want to say it.
Well, this is all happening in a very small window, in my opinion.
And we'll get into it more, but we also have to think about the time period. I mean, this is the very early 60s. We didn't have a term for serial killer yet.
No, it's true. Or they didn't even think like that. They didn't think that there's someone out here hunting people.
Right.
Right.
Evidence was collected from the 3 apartments, including rugs, runners, linens, blankets, and floor sweepings, and they were all sent to the forensic lab. Tested were minute items like a thread from a man's suit to a single human hair. After all, it had been a piece of wood that had helped solve the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. So at least they are taking evidence, no matter how minuscule, seriously.
I'm actually rather surprised that they're doing things like sweepings and, nowadays they're going with a vacuum and get all the fibers. But it sounds like even if it's in the most basic state or method, they're actually trying to analyze fibers and hairs. So I'm really surprised they were even thinking like that in the 60s.
Right. And that's why I say I feel like this case really kind of set a precedence for future investigations. It was on July 11th around 10 a.m. when a chambermaid entered a cheap motel room to clean up. Moments later, she departed the room screaming. Inside, a nude woman lay across the bed. She had gray hair and her clothes were draped over a chair, but all identification had been removed. The woman had been strangled with bare hands, an autopsy would reveal. She and a man, appearing to be intoxicated, had signed in under the name Mr. and Mrs. Byron Spaney, listing a Catholic convent as their home address. The victim would be identified as Mrs. Margaret Davis, a 60-year-old widow from Roxbury. She had actually known the nuns at the convent as they had been trying to help her with alcohol addiction, which had plagued her life. There was no clothing item used this time and no prominent positioning of the body, so police were unsure if the murder was connected to the others. Boston at the time was considered quite conservative. Leftover ideals from the Puritans were still in existence. And though the murders were shocking, it seemed to be the sexual aspect that profoundly disturbed the community. Violent death might be expected in places like New York City and Chicago, but Bostonians preferred to keep those details quiet. Most murders were relegated to the Bowery area, like the South End. So for this to be happening all over in neighborhoods,
right,
to just regular women was astonishing.
So it's happening in their minds, outside of the bad part of town, quote unquote.
Yeah. At the time, Boston had seen a decline during the post-war boom years. People just didn't seem to want to settle there. But in the early 1960s, industry was showing up again, including Prudential Insurance Company, which had made a $200 million investment in the city. National Aeronautics and Space Administration installations were growing around the city. It was a new Boston in the making. Not to mention President Kennedy was in the White House. So they've got their own local golden boy in the White House. So it's kind of bringing this new renewed image to Boston. Perhaps the residents didn't want to ruin a good thing. The crimes would show a completely different picture of the city and shock the world. So while they're trying to build a new image and brand and attract businesses, attract new residents, the president's from this area, it's a great place to be, they don't really want to publicize we've got brutal murders happening to regular, just working women.
Yeah, not only brutal, just the almost taboo in nature with the sexual deviancy, with the posing and the assault with the foreign objects. Yeah, these are types of things that people just don't want to discuss.
Well, you don't want to think about it happening.
No, you almost can't imagine that it's really happening.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? You want to be like, oh, maybe they were mistaken, or maybe it's not really that.
And these are people, again, who are very conservative. You have a large Irish Catholic population in the city. And they don't want to imagine there's some sex fiend out there doing these horrific, unimaginable things to people.
You're listening to an episode of Mountain Murders on True Crime by Indie Drop-In Network. We're going to take a quick break.
It is Ryan here, and I have a question for you. What do you do when you win? Like, are you a fist pumper, a woohooer, a hand clapper, a high fiver? I kind of like the high five, but if you want to hone in on those winning moves, check out Chumba Casino. At ChumbaCasino.com, choose from hundreds of social casino-style games for your chance to redeem serious cash prizes. There are new game releases weekly, plus free daily bonuses. So don't wait. Start having the most fun ever at ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW. Void were prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
Lucky Land Casino, asking people, what's the weirdest place you've gotten lucky?
Lucky? In line at the deli, I guess?
Aha, in my dentist's office. More than once, actually.
Do I have to say?
Yes, you do.
In the car before my kids' PTA meeting.
Really?
Yes.
Excuse me, what's the weirdest place you've gotten lucky?
I never win and tell.
Well, there you have it. You can get lucky anywhere, playing at LuckyLandSlots.com. Play for free right now. Are you feeling lucky? No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18+. Terms and conditions apply. See website for details.
And now back to this episode of Mountain Murders.
I did not know. Of course, strangling is very brutal, up close and personal. I think you got to be a certain type of monster to do that. But I did not realize all this other stuff was mixed in with the victims, as far as the posing and the assault with foreign objects.
You're welcome, Dylan.
Thanks.
I'm here to educate.
I appreciate it.
McNamara, the commissioner, reached out to the FBI and asked for a specialist in sex crimes to conduct a seminar as soon as possible with the Boston Police Department. I mean, this guy's very forward-thinking.
Yeah, he truly is.
At the end of the day.
Yeah.
He would send 50 chosen detectives to the training. After they had completed the course, McNamara planned to assign them to these strangulation cases. In the hours after Margaret Davis's discovery, police arrested a man who was seen leaving the Roosevelt Hotel with scratches on his face. It seemed that her murder stood on its own and was not connected to the others. So we will see there are some cases of murder with similar MO, but that might not be, that maybe shouldn't be grouped into this. And when we get into part 2, we have a lot of theories. We'll talk about some of the cases that very, I would say people who with a lot more knowledge than myself don't believe are actually part of this, or think there may have been multiple criminals, multiple killers.
Well, yeah, you get that, and you have, it's not like no one ever gets strangled. So, I mean, it does happen. But, and you also get the sicko copycats that, when you have
that. And again, part 2, it's going to be a big discussion. We have a lot more to discuss in part 2. Yet Boston police were still not sure about connecting the first 3 murders. Boston had a large concentration of single women and women living alone. Public image aside, the idea of a homicidal maniac on the loose could utterly demoralize a city like Boston. Several tips were called into the hotline. An older woman who was Nina Nichols' neighbor reported seeing a man, maybe around 40 years old, sitting in a gray sedan on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, the weekend that Nina was killed. Described him as sitting parked below their apartment building, just staring up.
Okay.
Yeah, that's troubling.
That's a little odd.
That's not okay. A 22-year-old woman who lived not far from Anna Slessor's apartment was followed home by a man who tried to strangle her with a wire, but she managed to escape. Police located a 4-foot telephone wire on the ground near her apartment. A man was found lurking nearby but denied being involved in the assault. A 45-year-old woman met a young Marine at the Golden Nugget in Boston. Now, I'm not sure if that's a bar.
Well, if it is a bar, I would go there and have a drink.
A casino? The only Golden Nugget I'm aware of is in Vegas. Now, after drinking heavily, they went back to his apartment where he forced her into the basement. After grabbing her throat, he raped the woman and whispered, quote, "I like to choke older women."
Oh my God.
So she reported that to the police. The FBI sex crime seminar got underway in early August. Many seasoned detectives were shaken after the lecture. They learned about 50 different types of sexual perversion, deep compulsions, different sex categories, and symptoms of these like sex-related illnesses, if you will. They discovered a great deal more about how some sex crimes escalate. Like, for example, a man who might expose himself to children might later need more stimulation. Then rapes and murders could follow.
Yeah, it's almost like they're practicing.
Because at this point, I mean, today, this seems kind of common knowledge, especially for those of us who are true crime enthusiasts or have this interest in true crime. Like, we kind of know this, but you have to think about in the 60s, most everyday people, they didn't have this information. Even law enforcement didn't know a lot about sex crimes and this kind of deviancy and the psychology behind and how these crimes might escalate.
Right. At first, it may be though, like you said, no one wants to be flash, but they don't realize this person could go on to murder, rape.
With their newfound knowledge, the detectives were sent back out to work the cases again. They interviewed more suspects, persons of interest, because now they're armed with this new information and they kind of have a whole new way of looking at these cases and the questions they should be asking and what might stick out, details that might stick out.
Yeah, something they may have paid no attention or very little attention to before now could be a red flag.
So again, I think this McNamara guy, he's pretty on top of his game.
Well, it seems like he's trying to get out in front of it and, trying to which is very fortunate because, just warning, even to a small degree, warning the public to be on the lookout, report any strange people, things like that. I think that is what, when they do believe they're connected, but they're reluctant to tell the population, I think that's what they're missing out on. Warning people to be hyper vigilant. And maybe, you never know. You might catch the guy because he's, casing somebody's house or something.
You're right, Dylan. On August 21st, Ida Urga, a 75-year-old woman, was found strangled in her locked apartment. She lived on the top floor at 7 Grove Street, a 5-story brick apartment building in Boston's West End. It had once been a very lovely area, but at that time was kind of run down, and people referred to it as the wrong side of Beacon Hill. Mrs. Urga had been a widow for 30 years. She rarely left her apartment after dark and was known to do small amounts of shopping. The way it's been described about Mrs. Urga is that she was precautious. She liked to go out after dark. She tried to do small amounts of shopping, kind of here and there. She wasn't really one to go out very often. She had been dead for 2 days when discovered. Though a pillowcase had been tightly tied around her neck, it was manual strangulation with hands that killed her. She had been sexually assaulted too. Her purse containing cash was visible in this 3-bedroom apartment, untouched, along with several pieces of gold jewelry. She had been seen 2 days before on Sunday when she had met a friend at the Boston Common where they had sat in the sun together. She left telling her friend, quote, "I want to get home before dark." Around 1 p.m., she phoned her sister to say she had half a cooked chicken that she was willing to give her. "It's too hot to cook. Let me give you half this chicken."
I think the reason possibly he's picking these victims in this age range and all that is because it's an easier victim, if you will, as far as strength-wise. They're older, and the likelihood that they live alone, which gives him time to do whatever crazy, sick stuff he wants to do. So maybe, I think in my mind, if I was an investigator, I'd be wondering if that's why he's picking these particular women to assault.
Well, Dylan, that has been mentioned. There are investigators and folks tied to this case who think that's one of the main motives for attacking women of this certain age.
Right.
Yeah. Yet her sister didn't hear from her again after she called and said, "Hey, I have this chicken." She never called back. 2 days later, her sister called the building manager on Tuesday evening to see if he would check on Ida. The woman was found lying on her back on the living room floor wearing only a nightdress. It was torn, exposing her body. A pillowcase was discovered around her neck. Now, Dylan, this is a very descriptive, brutal thing I'm about to discuss. So again, if you're listening, these types of things affect you, you might want to skip ahead a couple of minutes. Okay. This woman, it was a very intentional posing, okay? The woman's body had been propped up with a pillow under the buttocks, and her legs were spread wide open, and they were placed on chairs as if in an intentional obstetrical position. So you can imagine when ladies go to the gyno and we put our feet up in stirrups, you know what that looks like, right? You can imagine. So this poor woman has been propped up and her legs spread and legs placed in these chairs, almost like putting her feet in the rungs of the chairs
to keep it there.
Keep her there.
Oh my God.
And one bit of research I found described it as her legs were spread about 5 feet apart.
So she's splayed. She's like almost to the full width that she could possibly be spread apart.
The killer had placed this poor woman in an awful position so that one could not escape seeing it when they opened the door.
Yeah,
that is just sick.
It's very sick.
It's fucking sick.
See, not only are they humiliating their victim after even post-mortem, they're also, I think they're getting off on the idea of someone discovering them like this and the shock.
Now, my main resource, which I will give later, is a book, Boston Strangler. And it did not provide me with this information, but one of the, and see again, there's some misinformation out there, so I'm not sure, but I thought I would mention it, is that the building superintendent had actually sent his 13-year-old son to check on this woman.
Oh my God.
And that it was a 13-year-old who found her. But I have not been able to verify if that was accurate, but just imagine anyone finding this.
Let alone
would
a child.
Be horrible. But yes, a young boy to see this.
Terrible.
Would haunt you for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, even the most seasoned cop or detective would leave a mark on them.
Now, these details, this information was kept from the press. One, they're likely not going to want to publish something like this. It was a different time. This is a very conservative area. But also police did not want to get this information out there because they were hoping that a suspect might accidentally drop these details later.
Well, yeah.
So they're keeping this kind of close to the sleeve, which is smart.
Yeah, this is a type of information only the killer would know. if they were there.
Right. So now the police have a fourth murder on their hands. But rumors began to take hold of the vicious attacks. Sexually obscene positioning and the nature of the attacks started to leak. People speculated the killer had superhuman strength and could possibly scale tall buildings and enter through the windows.
Come on, people.
But, the doors are locked.
Well, I know, but I mean, that just shows you how the public's imagination can run wild with something like this.
It's like Spider-Man, right? Just scaling the wall, entering into the apartment. Women all but barricaded themselves into their homes. They are gripped in fear, Dylan.
Well, how could you not be?
There were demands for locksmiths to rekey doors and add extra security. Dogs were cleaned out from the animal shelters, people looking for a security dog.
Mm-hmm.
Elderly widows asked their children to phone them 3 to 5 times a day to check up on them to make sure they were okay. Women began reporting obscene phone calls. One woman reported that a prowler had left a doll in her mail with a nylon stocking around its neck and a note that said, quote, "The police can't watch you forever."
Oh, my God.
A woman who lived near Nina Nichols' apartment reported a man dressed in women's clothing, wearing makeup, riding the service elevator up and down the apartment building. Just seemed odd to her.
Well, I think most people would find that odd, especially back in the 60s. That's something that you wouldn't expect to see.
Right. I mean, today, I don't think that would really stand out for people to be like, oh, that's the criminal. But
no, today you just be like, that's my barista. You know, let me get my latte, bud.
Yes. They, them are giving my latte.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, that's fine. I just want a latte.
But it's a different time. One woman began taking meticulous notes about her neighbor's activities, documenting his comings and goings in a notebook. She took a keen interest in this neighbor who happened to be a doctor and began almost stalking his movements. And later, she's going to try to turn all of this over to police.
And say, I think I've found the killer.
Yes.
Wow.
But that's the kind of vigilance people were taking on, these very vigilant activities to try to help because everyone is scared shitless.
Well, and some people, it may make them feel more safe and secure if they're being proactive, and the way they see it, they're being proactive, trying to do something about it.
The Boston Herald published an editorial entitled "Hysteria Solves Nothing," which quoted the statistical improbability of becoming a murder victim. Yet people were terrified. The opinion piece did little to assuage fears. Not only had these women been victimized, but the entire city was being victimized. Single women of all ages were living in fear. They were on edge. Many couldn't sleep at night. Petrified, women were refusing to leave their apartments. It was just unfathomable. I mean, you have to consider, again, the time frame. The word serial killer, as we mentioned, has not yet been coined. The idea of one person committing these atrocities was shocking. Think of school shootings. How before Columbine, we would have never thought it was possible.
No.
And we didn't even have the term school shootings
or
mass
active shooters.
We were just like, yeah, that would have made no sense to me in 1990.
No.
But in 1998, 99, I knew exactly what that meant because of Columbine. So, I mean, now it's commonplace for us to talk about. But at this time, it just wasn't. And people were looking at their neighbors, their pharmacist, their milkman, and thinking, you could be the killer. It could be anyone.
See, this is terrorism. This is domestic terrorism. I mean, this criminal, this monster is achieving what terrorist cells and groups would love to do this effectively. Getting people to change their daily routines to live in fear 24/7. I mean, this is what they dream of, and this guy's achieving it. And I think they should actually saddle people like this with a terrorism charge. I'm sorry, because this whole metropolitan area is living in fear every day.
I listened to an interview with someone who was residing, in and around the area at the time of the Boston Strangler. And this woman who wished to remain anonymous, it was an interview, was saying how she was 15, 16 when these happened, and that up until she was in her 30s, that she had this extreme anxiety and paranoia, and it caused her to have insomnia, and that she spent like decades living in fear, thinking she would become a murder victim and that someone was going to break in her house and kill her while she was sleeping.
And you lived in an area around D.C. when the D.C. sniper thing was happening.
Oh, yeah.
And so you can attest to the fact that people are just, you would see people, you've told me, running through the parking lot, like zigzagging to go in and pay for damn gas and come back out. People looking over their shoulder. People just,
I remember opening like the front door of my car and the back door of my car.
Oh, to protect yourself.
And so it created a little,
wow,
like a little square for me, and pumping my gas and like hiding down between the two doors, waiting on like ducking down and waiting for the pump to finish.
Jeez. That's scary.
And we have a friend from a karaoke friend, right? And he's from Maryland, and he lived there at the time and was actually working in news and was like a cameraman and covered these crimes. And the first murder that was in Kensington, like a mile from my house.
Wow.
And he was there at the scene. I mean, we've had a very, interesting discussion about what it was like living there. And it was terror. It really was. And these people are being terrorized, as you mentioned. I mean, this is true terror, to not know who the killer is and just attacking at random.
It's very scary. And I have no doubt that people who live through this carry it with them and PTSD.
And with this serial killer, you have some that they'll have a lag. They have a murder that pops up every couple of years, a victim.
Right.
But these are so close.
Yes.
You have two in the same day.
He's very, very active, and that makes it even scarier, honestly.
6 days after Ida Urga's murder, 67-year-old nurse Jane Sullivan was found strangled in her first-floor apartment at 435 Columbia Road. The apartment was in Dorchester, on the other side of Boston from Ida Urga. So the exact opposite, side of the city. She worked the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift at the Longwood Hospital, where she was known as reserved and efficient. So again, another victim with ties to the medical community and a hospital.
So does that pan out as any kind of a reason? I mean, are they connected like this, or is this just a happenstance?
Well, it seems to be a happenstance, but it's just a very strange coincidence, right? And I don't know if it's just because maybe women at this time,
but that's one of the predominant,
that was sort of one of the predominant fields
right,
that women worked in as nurses and nurses' aides and that kind of thing. But it's a very strange coincidence, right?
You're listening to an episode of Mountain Murders on True Crime by Indie Drop-In Network. We're going to take a quick break. And now back to this episode of Mountain Murders.
She never associated with men. She had recently moved into the apartment after hearing about the murders because of a long walk from the bus stop to her previous building.
So she's trying to move into what she feels is a safer apartment.
Yes. When she was found, Sullivan had been she'd been dead for more than a week. She was face down, submerged in bath water, with her buttocks intentionally exposed. So almost like draped over the bathtub.
The morbid irony in the fact that she moved into this other apartment to feel safer, but in actuality, it put her in the sights of the killer. Or just, it just happened. It's just, that's really kind of messed up if you think about it.
It is. And we have another victim with a similar situation that we're going to discuss, and it's pretty fucked up too, Dylan. She had been strangled with 2 nylon stockings. Evidence showed the women had been murdered in another room, or that this woman had been murdered in another room and then carried to the bathroom and posed in the bathtub. So again, this is another victim who was murdered in one room and positioned in another.
Yeah.
She was found dead on Thursday, August 30th. Her estimated time of death meant she had been strangled probably around 10 days earlier. They said a week to 10 days, but they're thinking more like 10 days within a 24-hour period from when Ida had been killed. Ida Urga's son, Joseph, noted how similar Sullivan resembled his mother at first glance. When he saw a photo of Jane Sullivan, he actually thought it was his mother.
Wow.
Because they looked so much alike. Then 3 months passed with nothing. No murder, no bodies. Yet the city is still gripped with fear. A Brockton housewife reportedly fell dead from a heart attack when she opened the door to find a strange man standing there. Turns out this guy was just an encyclopedia salesman.
Oh my
But
gosh.
that gives you an example of how women were feeling at this time. Working women hurried home before dark, careful to lock the doors behind them. Headlines took over the newspapers with salacious names like The Mad Strangler, Phantom Strangler, and The Sunset Killer. Particular articles compared the Boston Strangler to Jack the Ripper. In trying to find a connection among the victims, law enforcement looked at the neighborhoods. 2 of the victims had been nurses and 1 a physiotherapist. 2 victims had received outpatient care before their murders. So was the killer associated with the hospitals? The killer had worn gloves when searching the apartments, it appeared. They weren't finding fingerprints. Law enforcement is really looking at this like the perfect crime scene or the perfect murder, because there's really not much being left behind as far as evidence.
No, and there's been multiple, it's not like it just happened one time and they got, they did good that time. This person's almost is very adept at getting in and out of these places without being seen. They're not sure how he's making entry into them because they're assuming that most of them have been locked doors and leaving not very much evidence at all behind. But at the same time, taking time, that comfort level has got to be disconcerting to investigators as well. It's like he knows he's not going to be disturbed, and he's taking the time to do these things, like with the assaults, with the foreign objects, and the posing of the victims. That's stuff that you have to be very calm and collected after you just did this to this person, to still take all this time.
It lets me know, Dylan, that this killer, these were not random attacks. I truly think the assailant was stalking these women.
I agree.
And had to know their schedules and that they lived alone, and that if he entered into the apartment and committed this crime, that he would have ample opportunity to ransack, position, pose these women, because he knew he would not be interrupted.
Right. I agree completely. I don't think there's any way that he just happen to pick, even if you see an older woman, you don't know that she lives alone. She could have a roommate, she could have some family member or a grandkid or anything. She could have a husband for all you know. So I definitely believe he stalked his victims.
Well, the fact that he's ransacking the apartments but not really taking anything and wearing gloves, the police wondered if there was like an item in particular that the killer was searching for. Psychiatrists tried to analyze the Strangler. 2 well-known doctors agreed the killer likely worked a regular 9-to-5 job and blended into a crowd. They speculated he committed the crimes on his way home from work so as not to be absent from a day job or be away from home at night. This would explain his phantom quality. He was invisible because he could shift in and out with everyone kind of moving around him, bringing no second glance. So
and
this is a person who is just going to blend right in,
right,
and not stand out.
He doesn't look like a crazy mean guy or anything. He's normal seeming or in appearance, and if someone did happen to catch a glance, he just looks like every other Joe
right,
schmo.
So if you saw him walking down the hall of the apartment building, he's not going to draw attention unless you are just being vigilant, hyper vigilant. But he's probably just going to look like any regular person walking around, perhaps a maintenance man, right? The knots used by the Strangler, I wanted to mention, were a couple of different knots, by the way. One was a granny knot, a square knot, and then several victims have a double half hitch. So the police wondered if the murderer had an occupation associated with being a sailor, a surgeon, a warehouse packer, maybe a newspaper wrapper, or even a shoe salesman. So these ideas were all checked against suspects, but brought little results. And I do know, I'm not going to say I'm an expert on knot tying, and I'll be honest, I'm terrible at it. But I did have to go through like seamanship courses when I was in the Navy, and they teach you that. Plus, I had taken like a water activities class with kayaking, and we learned a lot about knot tying and ropes. So I just thought I would share what a double half hitch knot is for those who may not have been Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts or in the Navy.
It's not something you do by accident. Is that right?
No. So a half hitch knot is often used in mooring, like a boat to a pier, that kind of thing. It is a nautical knot, and some people might even compare it to a clove hitch. They do have similar qualities. There's only a slight difference between the two. And if you see a double half hitch knot, it has a pretzel appearance. The hitch does. It might be used to secure an animal or like an item to a ring, a pole, a bar, or some kind of post. And it's not a secure knot necessarily, but it's a good knot for like a strangler.
Okay.
Because you can sort of easily, it's almost like a garrote. Like you could easily kind of
I see.
Work it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense.
So again, they're curious about these knots. Suspects were pouring in all the time. Some were sent, tips were sent in anonymously. Others were individuals brought in by police for loitering, being peeping toms. One man reportedly stole women's undergarments in this particular neighborhood, so he was arrested and brought in. Some alcoholics turned themselves in for fear they had carried out the murders while blacked out.
Oh my gosh, dude, you need to turn yourself into AA if you're worried. He's like, I don't know. I'm not sure. I just woke up. And maybe I did it. I've been drunk since Thursday.
You do that pretty well.
Well, I am accessing my spirit animal, which is actually Otis.
Is like an old hobo?
No, it's Otis from Andy Griffith's show.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. That's my spirit animal.
So like the lovable town drunk?
Yeah, I'm not dangerous, I'm just
affable. You just need like a warm bench to sleep on.
Nah, just let me sleep it off.
Yeah.
But Andy never charged him with anything, so Otis's record's clean.
Well, unfortunately, you were in your wife's jail.
Yes. Things are different.
And I'm not a nice jailer.
Holy shit.
On Wednesday, December 5th of 1962, Sophie Clark left the Carnegie Institute for Medical Technology around 12:30 p.m. for her apartment. The apartment was shared with two female roommates. It was located on the 4th floor of 315 Huntington Avenue near Back Bay, only 2 blocks from where Anna Slessler lived. She needed to return to school at 2 p.m. for a class photograph. So people were not quite sure why she would have left, taken this hour and a half to go back home. She wrote an incomplete letter to her fiance during the break, and it was discovered at the crime scene. So law enforcement speculated she was writing this letter when she was interrupted. At 5:30 p.m., her roommate found Sophie lying dead on the living room rug. She had been strangled with a pair of nylon stockings twisted so tightly into her neck that they were nearly lost and embedded like in the flesh.
My goodness.
Her white slip and white elastic belt were also found around her neck. She was nude, had a bathrobe opened, and she wore black stockings and garter belts. Her bra was torn off, her glasses broken. The woman was still wearing penny loafers. She had been sexually assaulted. There was evidence of a struggle. The apartment, again, totally wrecked. The roommate had to enter through a double lock door. Sophie had insisted they install a second lock after reports of the phantom circulated. Sophie refused entry to people unless she knew exactly who they were. There was no sign of forced entry, so police again theorized that Sophie must have allowed the attacker inside the apartment. Now, some things about Sophie's murder stood out to detectives. First of all, Dylan, she's only 20 years old.
Oh, wow.
So quite an age difference from the previous victims. Secondly, Sophie was African American, while the other women had all been older white women. And this time, the killer had left something behind. Seminal stains were discovered on the rug next to Sophie's body. The Strangler had not left behind such solid physical evidence before. I mean, even though it would be decades before DNA could assist with solving, the seminal fluid.
Right.
The identity of the ejaculator, right? For some, and we're diving into theories in part 2, the Clark murder represented either a copycat killer or a complete 180 from what the Strangler had been doing. Now, Dylan, in most cases, serial killers, they don't really change up their MO, right? Like if they have a type, like the older middle-aged women between 55 to 75, it's pretty rare for a killer to go in a different direction, like go for a younger victim, especially one of a differing race.
Right.
We don't see that. Now, with some serial killers like Samuel Little,
he didn't care.
He
was a killer of opportunity.
Exactly. So again, I'm not so sure that's a good argument to say, well, we don't think this could be coupled in with these murders. Because I think a serial, you can't predict what they're going to do.
No.
These are deranged people.
Well, they're not reasonable people. So you're trying to, apply logic and reason to everything they do. I mean, just one of these crimes should let you know that they're off their rocker and they're not, totally viewing things the way you do.
I mean, a lot of the investigators and profilers and folks who are, studied in the Boston Strangler point to like Ted Bundy and his victim profiles. I mean, he liked, women in their 20s with long brown hair that parted in the middle, and they all kind of had a very similar look.
Right.
But I just don't think that's true. And though many former FBI agents and psychiatrists have pointed this out to explain Sophie Clark's murder as not the work of the same killer, I mean, again, I think we're discussing these deranged psychopaths and anything is possible. And this really could be, he could be a killer of opportunity.
Yeah, he could
as you mentioned, he was practicing on these older women, thinking they're weaker, they're easier to overpower physically.
More vulnerable.
And then now he's moving on to something new.
Or he just saw his chance and he took it.
Right. Also, it has been reported that Sophie was afraid of living in Boston. She had asked her mother months before if she might be able to transfer to a different college in New York. Sophie's roommate recalled promising the woman's mother that she would, quote, take care of her. After Sophie's mother, the roommate didn't know how she would find the strength to tell Sophie's mother what had happened.
Oh, my God. That's terrible.
And this woman, I listened to an interview with her, and she felt immense guilt about what had happened to her roommate.
I understand that. And, but I mean, it's not her fault, obviously. And I'm sure maybe there's survivor guilt to a degree because that could have easily been her there instead of her roommate. But, yeah, that's terrible because she's like, oh, don't worry, Mom. I'll look after her. It's going to be okay. And then, boom, she falls victim to a horrible crime.
A neighbor told investigators that around 2:20 p.m. on the day of Sophie's murder, a man knocked on the door claiming he had been sent by the superintendent to do some painting. Feeling uncomfortable, the woman immediately told him she wasn't due for a painting, but he pushed by her anyway, just walked into her apartment. After he made some strange remarks about her figure and asked if she'd done any modeling, this woman quickly told him, my husband is asleep in the next room, so you probably need to leave. The man left the apartment quickly saying, quote, perhaps I have the wrong apartment. And Dylan, remember this modeling detail? It's going to be a crucial part of our second episode. And we're going to get more into discussing this modeling aspect.
Oh, wow.
It's going to come up. Sophie, police discovered, was a girl of regular habits. She had a long-term boyfriend who lived in New Jersey. She had school every day until 1 p.m. She returned to the apartment nearly every afternoon to study and do schoolwork. Around 4 p.m., she prepared supper for herself and 2 roommates. And the female roommates moved immediately and did not reveal the location of their new housing after this murder. They were terrified.
Right, you can't blame them.
Come back. I should also note that Sophie's murder kind of felt different. Unlike the previous murders, the killer had been extremely careful not to leave behind evidence. They were, again, considered perfect crime scenes, especially in the decades before forensic technology brought us, DNA. But this one seemed almost frenzied. He's leaving behind evidence. He's not as careful.
Well, and then the completely different victim, age, race. So, I mean, I don't blame investigators for wondering if this is honestly the same killer. I mean, there's a lot of differences here.
3 weeks after Sophie Clark's murder, on Monday, December 31st, 23-year-old Patricia Bissett was found dead in her locked apartment located at 515 Park Drive. It was the same Back Bay area where Anna Slesser and Clark had resided. So, same neighborhood. Patricia was a secretary at Engineering Systems. Patricia was found in her bed with a white blanket or comforter kind of pulled up to her chin as if she had been tucked into bed. A very different crime scene, right? She had been strangled with 3 nylon stockings knotted around her neck. She was naked from the waist down, her leopard print pajama top pushed up to expose her breasts. There was no sign of sexual intercourse, or as if she had been sexually assaulted anyway, though they did speculate that she had been sexually active probably within 48 hours of the murder.
Okay.
But they did not feel like it was a rape or an assault. There was no sign of forced entry. She had last been seen doing laundry in the community laundry area of the building around 3:30 on Saturday afternoon. By 4:30 p.m., the neighbor who had seen her doing laundry noted that Bissett's clothing had been removed from the dryer, so she had obviously finished her laundry and had gone back to her apartment. During autopsy, it was discovered that Patricia was 1 month pregnant. She had also been having an affair. Police theorized maybe she'd left her door unlocked when she'd gone to do laundry, or maybe the killer had waited in the closet while Patricia had kind of done the laundry and gone about her business, and then maybe hijacked her when she came back in. Okay, so let's discuss Patricia's murder for a moment longer, Dylan. Patricia, as I mentioned, was having an affair with her married boss, man named Jules Rothman, who had 2 kids. Patricia was pregnant and had apparently told him this some weeks before, or, in the week before or something like that. Rothman had even spoken to a friend about trying to arrange an illegal abortion for Patricia. Rothman had been the one to discover Patricia and immediately said to law enforcement, "Oh my God, she's been strangled." Yet at first glance, as she's covered up in the bed, there was no way of knowing she had been strangled, at least not visually.
Now, are they going to take a hard look at him as possibly being the perpetrator?
Well, if you'll let me get through my
gosh.
Police had really believed Rothman was the prime suspect in Patricia's murder and that she was not a victim of the Strangler. Yet in part 2, I will share with you a story provided by a woman who was the previous tenant in Patricia's apartment and had only recently moved out.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so we're going to talk about that in part 2. You're going to want to hear part 2 of this.
You're listening to an episode of Mountain Murders on True Crime by Indie Drop-In Network. We're going to take a quick break. And now back to this episode of Mountain Murders.
Like Sophie Clark, Bissett may or may not be a true victim of the Strangler, as we've been told. Again, part 2 is going to be very important. You're going to want to tune in for that. Now, it seemed the killer no longer focused on women of a certain age, meaning these older middle-aged women. Now, career girls were being killed. After 6 similar murders had been committed around the city of Boston, police were no closer to a suspect. There was no evidence left behind, really, and all that could be said by the end of 1962 was that no woman in Boston was safe.
So we've had 4 older women and two young girls.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, Dylan, this is where the story, in my opinion, takes another twisty turn that's kind of interesting. And if you've seen the Hulu movie Boston Strangler starring Keira Knightley, it is kind of based on what I'm about to tell you. Let's get into it, Dylan. On the morning after Patricia's murder, Jack McClain, city editor of the Boston Record-American, called in 2 reporters, and these are 2 female reporters, Jean Cole and Loretta McLaughlin. Both were married women in their 30s who had young children. And though it was not entirely common to have women journalists or women reporters, some papers did, but these women were usually like relegated to very fluff pieces.
Right, like a kitten getting stuck in a tree.
Yes. Just kind of these bullshit
Or the
stories.
new firehouse opening down in the neighborhood.
Edna's prize goose won a blue ribbon at the county fair.
So not hard-hitting investigative journalism.
No, but these women were very talented writers, and they're really good at what they do. Both had earned recognition as journalists and frequently worked on medical stories. Jean, for example, had recently gone undercover to expose issues in Massachusetts nursing homes. Like, she dressed as a nurse, got jobs at these places, and went in and exposed horrific conditions, that they were understaffed, abusing patients, that these people were not receiving care. So these are serious journalists.
That takes guts to do something like that.
Loretta had already approached McClain about working on a Strangler story because the murder of Ida Urga had deeply troubled the woman. Now, McClain felt the women, these victims, were, quote, nobodies. And who would want to read articles about these nobodies?
Okay.
Loretta said, quote, that's just it. Why should 4 nobodies be murdered? Every woman in the city can identify with a woman and how they're in no way set apart from the other. I couldn't identify with them if they were celebrities, but if they're just like the rest of us, they're sisters under the skin to every woman who reads the paper.
That statement alone proves that she's not playing around.
No. So Jean and Loretta were assigned to go out and do some old-fashioned newspaper work and see what they could dig up. Governor Peabody had announced a $5,000 reward for information leading to the apprehension of the murder suspect, murder or murderers. One city councilman declared the police commissioner might be fired if the crimes weren't solved. Commissioner McNamara insisted everything was being done. Every man on his force, which was the 8th largest in the United States, the Boston PD, was working around the clock to find the Strangler. Yet McNamara was still reticent to publicly announce the murders were connected and insisted on saying the person's responsible.
See, he's done a good job. I mean, he's been pretty proactive on this, forward thinking in many things. But that's a mistake. I think that's a mistake.
During a city council meeting, he made comments that there were too many dissimilarities to make one man responsible. And he's completely excluding the Clark and Bissett murder from these 4 older women.
So in his mind, when he's talking about that case, he's talking about the 4 older women.
Yes. Because again, I think deep down he knows, but he just doesn't want to be the one to say it. The reporters decided printing the facts would show if the murders fit a pattern and perhaps point to the killer. The women returned to the crime scenes, they interviewed neighbors, and tried to figure out how it all happened. The women, whose pictures were usually published next to their bylines, began receiving crank letters and obscene phone calls until they both had to request unlisted phone numbers. They started being targeted and harassed.
I never understood the obscene phone caller, honestly. Have you? I mean, really?
No, it's
like you're
so
just gonna
weird.
What are you wearing? Is that macaroni you're eating? I mean, come on, man. I've never gotten it.
I don't know.
Well, what you got to do is you just got to embrace it and act like, hey, you're here for this. Like, I've been waiting for you to call. You know, just weird them out.
I start breathing.
Start giving it
heavily
back
in the
to
phone
them, bud.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That's like if I see somebody in their car wanking it and they're trying to like be shocking or do some sort of sexual deviancy thing.
Right.
I like to point and laugh at them.
There you go.
Like you see a hater, point them out. I see a whacker, I point them out. And I'm like, hey, everybody, look, guy's jerking off in his car.
Look.
I remember doing that one time. And my friend's mom's like, oh, my God, don't do that.
He's pulling on his tiny pud.
And I'm like, why?
He's not dangerous.
There's like 40 people around. Everybody needs to look at this guy. Look at him. Hey, everybody, look at this guy over here.
Fucking weirdo.
He obviously wants attention. Yeah. Through autopsy reports, the women were able to piece together more information, stuff that hadn't been released to the public. The unpublished details were a sore spot for law enforcement, who considered it sabotage, whether it was good journalism or not. Reporters meddling in police work, that was just not acceptable according to law enforcement.
And I'm going to have to say it, the fact that it's two women probably sticks in their craw as well.
Oh, it did. By February, the women's daily articles were cut, and the reporters felt it was in part police pressure. But their conclusions were clear. There had been a clear linking of the stranglings. There was a pattern of victims and a pattern in the crimes. However, none of this information brought anyone closer to uncovering the identity of the strangler. 23-year-old Beverly Sammons wanted an operatic career. She had graduated from a music conservatory 3 years earlier and worked as a music therapist. When she failed to show up for choir practice or rehearsals, an organist left a note for her fiancé. Beverly was to appear in a production of Così fan tutti later in the month. It's, I guess, an opera. Oliver Chamberlain, her fiancé, went to the apartment at 4 University Road in Cambridge. Using a key, he unlocked the door. There he found Beverly dead, sprawled nude on a convertible sofa bed, her legs spread wide apart. Her wrists were bound with a sequin scarf. 2 nylon stockings and 2 handkerchiefs were tied using that half double hitch knot around her neck. There was blood on her neck and chest, and though it appeared she had been strangled, there were also multiple stab wounds.
Wow.
So this is different.
Quite different.
22 times the woman had been stabbed, 4 in the neck, 18 in the left breast. A bloody knife with a 4.5-inch blade was found in the kitchen sink. She had been dead for somewhere between 48 to 72 hours. A newspaper dated Sunday, May 5th was on the chair. Sunday had been the last day anyone had seen Beverly alive. Beverly was to receive her master's degree in rehabilitation counseling in June. Then she wanted to move to New York City and try out for the Metropolitan Opera. Some detectives theorized that Beverly had developed some strong throat muscle singing, and perhaps the strangler was unable to kill her that way.
Oh, wow. That's makes sense, honestly.
Her thesis was in the typewriter, but none of her notes were found. So they wondered if the strangler had stolen her notes for her thesis, which is odd. The thesis was entitled Factors Pertaining to the Etiology of Male Homosexuality.
Wow.
During the investigation, 2 psychics got involved with the task force in charge of the case. The first, named Paul Gordon, was an ad copywriter said to have ESP powers. He made a description of the killer of Anna E. Slessors, which fit Arnold Wallace, not his real name. That's a name that people have been using for years to describe this alleged perpetrator that the psychic knows about, right? We all know how police psychics work.
Well, yeah.
So this, quote, Arnold Wallace was a mental patient held at Boston State Hospital who had escaped on several occasions, most of which did coincide with the Strangler murders. When he was consulted about the 7th Strangler murder, that of Sophie Clark, he surprisingly displayed detailed knowledge of her apartment and made a description that fit a guy named Lewis Barnett, who was an initial suspect in that murder. Though I did not find any information on this Lewis Barnett, but I guess there had been a suspect, and the psychic had a description of the suspect, and it pointed to this Lewis Barnett. Now, from what I could find on Barnett, again, not a lot of information. I did find a little piece that he might have dated her at some point, or that they might have gone at least to a movie together, but she had a boyfriend and wasn't really interested in him, but that he may have been allowed into her apartment.
Oh, okay.
At some point. Nothing concrete came out of Gordon's suggestions. The second psychic, his name was Peter Herkos. He was a well-known career psychic. He claimed to have assisted in the investigation and is confirmed to have been in Boston at the time of the investigation and to have spent some time with Boston police. But a few days later, he was arrested for impersonating a police officer in order to gather some information and would later be convicted of it. So he's been pretty much dismissed. And we all know none of these psychics really ever make a difference in cases.
No, typically not.
As the summer of 1963 wore on, Bostonians breathed a sigh of relief with every passing week without a murder. Other headlines were making their way into the newspapers. Pope John's death was a big headline. The Civil Rights March on Washington, D.C., which happened in August, was a big story. And also the Soviets sending a woman into space. So these are kind of helping to alleviate some of the tension that was being felt. On Sunday, September 8th, in Salem, Massachusetts, 58-year-old Evelyn Corbin paid a visit to her friend, 66-year-old Flora Manchester. Now, Evelyn dated Flora's son, Bob, and the three were almost considered a family unit. So these women were neighbors, and they were in the habit of taking Sunday breakfast together. Mrs. Corbin then would attend Mass at 11:30 nearby at St. Teresa's Chapel. Each Sunday on her way out of the apartment building, she would tap on Mrs. Manchester's door to signal she was leaving, and then she would tap again once she returned. The women had breakfast as usual. Mrs. Manchester had thought she heard someone trying to unlock her door before the breakfast and even called Evelyn about it. However, they brushed it off and went on. They had their breakfast. Then it was around 10:30 a.m. that Evelyn walked down the hall a few yards to her apartment to get dressed for church. Around 11:10 a.m., Mrs. Manchester expected to hear a double knock on the door, but she didn't. Around 11:15, she phoned Evelyn to say, "You'll be late. Like, you need to get a move on." She didn't pick up the phone. At 12:30 p.m., after not hearing the departing knock or the arrival knock, the return knock, Mrs. Manchester phoned the drugstore across the street from their apartment building to ask if Evelyn had come by to pick up her Sunday newspaper. The clerk had not seen her. Around 1 p.m., Mrs. Manchester asked another neighbor to accompany her to Evelyn's apartment. She happened to have a key. They thought Evelyn maybe had fallen ill. Yet when they entered Evelyn's apartment, there was no denying what had happened. Evelyn Corbin was sprawled across the bed, still wearing her nightgown and robe from their breakfast. She had been strangled with 2 nylon stockings, knotted at the throat with an extra half double knot hitch. Her housecoat had been torn open with such force 3 buttons had popped off. She was grossly exposed in such a pose that extended her legs across the bed. And I'm not going to go into further detail. Another stocking was tied around her left ankle with the same double half hitch, which police knew to be the strangler's knot. Her underwear had been stuffed into her mouth as a gag. She was sexually assaulted in a manner newspapers couldn't describe, only that, quote, "the killer had satisfied an unnatural sexual appetite in the commission of his crime."
Wow. I guess that's about as far as they could go with it, saying what they're trying to say in the papers.
The apartment had been locked, according to police. 2 bureaus were half opened, as if the killer had done some searching through Evelyn's belongings. Out on the fire escape by Mrs. Corbin's apartment, they found a fresh donut. Yet no donuts were found inside the apartment. So they thought perhaps the killer waited out on the fire escape and had been eating donuts before murdering her. How weird.
Well, again, he's stalking. He's trying to, pick his prime opportunity.
After nearly a year's hiatus of killing women of a certain age, the Strangler seemed to be turning his attention away from the younger victims again, right? He was killing the elderly women, then he's killed these 2 younger women, and now he's back to killing older women. On Friday, November 22nd, 1963, Americans heard the news that President John F. Kennedy had been assassinated. A distraught Boston essentially shut down. And from what I gather, Dylan, it seems like the entire United States shut down when this happened.
Yeah, this was a flashbulb moment for that generation. Everyone remembers where they were when they heard the news.
Yeah, businesses closed, shops closed.
They were mourning.
Everybody just stopped what they were doing and went home or mourned. There were candlelight vigils everywhere. It was a big deal.
Very, very public assassination of your president.
Especially in Boston. I mean, this is Kennedy's stomping grounds.
Yeah. Yeah, and people are just way more patriotic and more trusting of the government, and they're more connected to their leaders than anything we have
and he was a
happening
beloved
now.
president.
Yes.
I mean, I think people really saw him as this, I don't know, example of kind of the American dream. He
or
was
maybe like
young, family man.
breath of fresh air, or maybe like he was like the
Yes.
bridge to the next generation for many people.
People were in mourning, many glued to their television sets all across the United States and especially in Boston. Sometime between 12:30 and 3:30 p.m., Bostonians and many Americans watched Lyndon B. Johnson attend St. John's Cathedral for a memorial service. Cameras flashed images of the White House where mourners were gathered on the lawn and all in front of the White House. 23-year-old Joanne Graff was raped and strangled inside her locked apartment in Lawrence, which was nearly an hour away from Boston. She was strangled with 2 nylon stockings with that extra half-hitch knot. The stockings were tied in a grotesque knot under her chin, which resembled a bow. She was nude except for a pink blouse, which was bunched up under her shoulders, her legs wide apart, and she had teeth marks on her breast, which was something new. He normally hadn't been biting the victims. The one-room apartment had been ransacked, yet untouched on the table was an envelope with cash, enough money to pay her gas bill plus several extra dollars. There was no sign of forced entry. It was learned that Joanne had few friends. She had only moved from Chicago 5 months earlier after graduating from the Chicago Art Institute. She taught 6th grade Sunday school at a Lutheran church in Lawrence. She worked full-time as a designer for a firm that created fabrics. Described as ultra-conservative, Joanne wouldn't even wear printed dresses because she thought it was too flashy.
Man, there's been multiple victims that have just recently moved. One was 2 weeks. One was even maybe less than that. And now here you are. Damn, that's kind of odd. It's kind of weird.
We're going to have another one come up that's odd.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh my God, is this guy a mover?
Well, let's talk about Joanne. Well, she also attended a Lutheran church, which Mrs. Slesser attended a Lutheran church. I mean, there are some coincidences with some of the victims. The music aspect.
The medical field.
The religious, their denomination. I mean, okay, so she wouldn't even wear printed dresses because she thought it was just too flashy. She's very conservative. Her landlord described Joanne as being extra cautious, having asked many questions about safety and the neighborhood before agreeing to move there. When he came by to collect the weekly rent, she would not allow him to enter her apartment. She always met him at the door. Her apartment was kept in meticulous condition from what he could see. Again, he was never allowed in, but just, eyeballing. When he would talk to her, he said her apartment seemed immaculate, just pristine. On the morning of her murder, the landlord had looked in behind her as she was paying rent and noticed that her breakfast dishes were already washed and tidied up. I mean, and he was impressed by this because she's a young woman living alone, and he's like, most of my young tenants are like messy college kids and stuff. And then she's not at all. She's very responsible. She was often found scrubbing the floors on her hands and knees when he would go knock on the door. So again, I mean, she's just kind of a certain type of person. Around 3:30 that afternoon, a woman named Mrs. Johnson, who attended church with her, had begun calling Joanne in 15-minute intervals to remind her that they would be there to pick her up. Her husband was going to be there at like 4:30 to pick up Joanne. They had made an agreement to give her a ride to church. So around 4:40 p.m., Mr. Johnson finally drove to the apartment building and knocked on the door. He and his wife were supposed to be picking her up at 4:30, and they hadn't been able to reach her, so they thought, well, we'll just go over and, maybe she got called up or there's a problem with the phone line or something. So a neighbor, 22-year-old engineering student Kenneth Rowe, had heard his wife complain recently that someone had been snooping around the halls at night. So when he heard footsteps outside the hall that day, he decided to tiptoe to the door and listen. He heard a man knock on the door, and he described the man as being around 27 years old with shiny pomade hair that resembled Elvis Presley. So I'm assuming a pompadour type of hairstyle. So he's listening. He hears this guy knock on his door. Kenneth opens up the door, and this stranger asks if Joan Graff lives there. Kenneth knew it was pronounced Joanne. Well, he explained that Graff actually lived downstairs on the floor below, like the floor beneath, and it was the apartment directly below him. Kenneth then heard the guy leave. He hears him go down the stairs, and he hears a knock on the door and assumes that Joanne has let this visitor inside. But again, the visitor is calling her Joan. So obviously the guy doesn't know her. Not well, anyway. So then so she's found dead. The Johnsons find her. It's very similar to the Strangler murders. But Lawrence police don't want to believe it's connected because they're like, well, we're an hour outside of Austin.
Right.
And it seems that Lawrence police, they were not really syncing up with the Boston police to help in the investigation. They were basically telling Boston police, this is our case, butt out.
Well, and in my mind, the reason the killer may be coming that far outside of the city is because the heat. People are in the city are hyper vigilant, looking over their shoulder. People are well aware of what's been happening. So maybe he's traveled outside the city so he can do what he wants without so much attention.
Well, it's really weird because here you've got Joanne. People are saying she's very conservative. She never let anybody in her apartment. She didn't have men coming over. So for her to let in the stranger,
right,
is like, okay, well, did she know this person? Or was there some reason why she allowed him into her apartment?
Or is he extremely charismatic or, able to, put people at ease? That could be some talent of his.
Then shortly after New Year's Day, 1964, 19-year-old Mary Sullivan moved into an apartment at 44A Charles Street with 2 roommates. She had just moved to Boston from Hyannis. On January 4th, which was a Saturday, the 2 roommates, named Patricia and Pam, returned to the apartment from work. They worked at a business called Filene's, which is a clothing store. And I'm thinking it might be Filene's Basement, which was a store in DC where I used to shop. And they have almost like closeout from high-end, like Neiman Marcus style, clothing designer and that kind of thing, but they get it kind of overstock or discounted, if that makes sense.
Well, it's like a ritzy Ross.
Yeah, Filene's is a pretty well-known store, so I'm assuming it's probably similar to Filene's Basement. And they find Mary dead. She had been strangled and posed in a horrific way. So this is a young woman who's just moved here, and she's in the process of moving in the apartment when she's killed.
Again.
Yes. So I was like, you ain't seen nothing yet, Dylan. This woman's moving in and she's murdered. She had been strangled and posed in a horrific way. Now, I'm not going to go into details because it is incredibly degrading what the strangler did to this woman. I will say she was assaulted with a foreign object. A charcoal-colored stocking and a pink silk scarf were tied with a bow under the chin. A Happy New Year card was propped up against the toes of her left foot.
It's so weird and gross. It's like the killer's sense of humor coming out or something. It's just, I don't know, so strange.
Inside Mary's apartment was a tiny sliver of foil, like the kind used to wrap film. It suggested to police that the strangler had carefully, possibly photographed the scene.
That could be his trophies.
Taking a memento. Yes.
Yeah.
Now the public uproar could not be contained. The Attorney General's Office of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the highest law enforcement agency in the state, would be taking over the Strangler case. Mary Sullivan's murder impacted the city because she represented so many young women. She was Irish Catholic from modest means, young, the youngest of victims, full of life, and moving to Boston to seek a job. You know, this was the kind of young woman that they see every day all over the city, the kind who moves here to get a job, is later going to get married, raise a family. It was not only the shock of horror, but the shock of recognition in this case, because she was like every young woman in the city. And these detectives, they have daughters this age.
Right.
They're sending their daughters out on their own. And, I listened to a podcast, again, I mentioned Stranglers, where they interviewed her nephew and people who went to high school with her, and they described her as being just this very reserved kind of young woman. She didn't have a whole lot of friends, and she'd really looked forward to moving to Boston to kind of just change her life, right? Jean Cole wrote a piece for the Boston Record American regarding the failures of the different police departments on working together, how they didn't share information and they were not coordinating. She suggested a clearinghouse be set up where everyone could focus on the details of the case. And she wasn't wrong. There were 6 different police departments working the Strangler murders. Some didn't recognize the murders were the work of a single killer. Therefore, they didn't feel they needed to share details with the other agencies. Some denied altogether that the murders in their town had anything to do with the Strangler murders. It's just a big clusterfuck.
I've never understood that.
You've got tips pouring in, but you don't have these agencies coordinating to investigate them. And we're going to get to one of those cases in part 2, a case that could have potentially solved the crime early on and prevented some of these murders if someone had just taken the tip seriously.
Well, that's why I don't understand. Even if you don't think yours is connected, sharing the information can't harm anything. You know what I mean? It may even just give the other investigators another idea or another viewpoint or a way to, or you could have somebody in your department who has a knack for, looking at this, type of information and coming up with a pattern or something. So I've never understood the pissing contest between agencies.
One fact stood out. All but 2 of the murders had taken place on the weekends. Anna Slessor's murder took place on a Thursday, June 14th, but that was also Flag Day, observed as a holiday in some states. So, again, it's pointing to the fact that, like the one psychiatrist theorized, this is a person who works like a regular job and they don't want to be missing from work.
Right.
Or draw attention to their absence. But on a Flag Day,
they might be off.
Exactly. So that's an interesting point that Jean Cole had mentioned in her article. Sophie Clark had been killed on a Wednesday. So you have 2 of the murders during a weekday, but the rest are all on weekends. A check showed that nearly 500 sex offenders had been released in Massachusetts the previous year. Yeah, it's a lot. Thousands more freed from other states. Police were operating under the theory that criminals stick to what they know. A pickpocket isn't interested in forgery. A home burglar isn't interested in stealing cars. So they needed to focus on suspects who had committed similar sex crimes. And I think that's smart.
Yeah, that's reasonable.
This is where we leave part 1 of the Boston Strangler.
Oh my gosh.
Okay.
I got to go process all this information.
So
Heather.
Join us next week for the conclusion. We're going to be discussing more cases. We're going to talk about the arrest, the trial, and theories surrounding the crimes. We'll also be discussing some cases in other states, but with a very similar MO as the Boston Strangler. And a suspect who was arrested in New York that could have been the Boston Strangler.
Damn.
And whether the person who's been charged is really the killer. And there are theories there could have been multiple killers. So we have a lot to talk about next episode. I hope everybody is doing well and didn't fall asleep during that. I know it was very lengthy.
No, I think it was engaging.
And we still have so much to discuss, Dylan.
Yeah, and I would like to thank the sponsors of today's show and all our patrons who so generously donate over there at patreon.com/Mountain Murders podcast. And you can get all kinds of extra content. You can help support us directly, which we really, really appreciate during these hard, tough, trying times. And there's a ton of content, and we have a lot of fun over there. We're a little bit different, a little bit even loosier and goosier.
Oh, gosh.
Imagine that type of
We
deal.
have ad-free episodes. Our top tiers have access to our other podcasts, Dancing with Myself, which is my 80s podcast. I have several new episodes. So if you're into 80s pop culture, music, movies, fashion, you're an 80s kid like myself, it'll be very nostalgic for you. Check that out. Again, that's called Dancing with Myself. And we have a movie podcast, Cult of Sleaze. Dylan, we have to record a new episode for the movie pod.
We watch bad movies, so you don't have to.
Yes, but you may be enticed to watch the bad movie after you hear our review.
Gosh, we watch some great ones. We have a lot of fun with all that. And so, yeah, we hope everyone likes to take a look on that. Take a look at that if you can or want extra content. There it is waiting on you.
Yeah, thanks so much. We'll be back on Wednesday with a brand new midweek episode, and then we will have part 2 next weekend.
All right. Thank you.
Stay safe.
Thank you, Heather.
Stay vigilant.
And look over your shoulder.
Yeah, it's true. Keep your head on the swivel, Dylan.
It's true.
Bye.
Bye.
To continue listening to this story, head to the Mountain Murders podcast using the link in the description below. Thanks again for listening to True Crime by Indie Drop-In Network. If you would like to nominate a true crime podcast to be featured, just send me a tweet at Indie Drop-In. I'd also love to hear if one of our featured podcasts is now your favorite show. Indie Drop-In survives off ad revenue and listener donations. If you would like to contribute, please consider buying me a coffee. You can go to buymeacoffee.com/Indie Drop-In. If you look at the very bottom of the episode description, I put a link in there to make it really easy. Indie Drop-In has many other shows that you also might like. Just go to indiedropin.com. All right, see you next week.